Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Finding a Brother for Jessica by Emma Ashwood. Prologue, 1870, Boston, Massachusetts. It was a dreary day in Boston, the sky devoid of color, with only hues of gray and white, creating a stark backdrop to what was the best day of Hazel's life. She stood in front of the small stone chapel, her heart racing with excitement even as the first drops of rain began to fall. The tombstones in the small cemetery beside the chapel glistened from the rain, turning a dark shade of gray, pronouncing the names all the more. The wind whipped and whistled as it raced through the trees, bringing a slight chill to her arms, but not even that could dim her happy mood. Hazel glanced down at the white dress she had borrowed from a friend, her only concern for it to remain white as she rushed towards the chapel. Her hair was braided onto her head like a lady of the tun, and for the first time in her life, Hazel felt beautiful. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside, out of the rain. Her kitten heels clattered on the stone floor, but Hazel didn't care. Some might say a bride should walk down the aisle with a pause between each step, but Hazel had waited 3 years for this moment, and she wasn't waiting for another second. When she had met Michael Irvin 3 years ago, she had been blown away by his charm and his vision of the man he wanted to become. He had worked on the trains, and Hazel had worked at the train station as a cleaner. What had started with a few smiles soon led to walking home together. She had fallen in love in the coldest months of the year and hadn't even been bothered by the snow because her heart had been warmed by love. For 3 years they had dreamed of a future together. They had dreamed of building a life together in Boston, 2 children and a small home filled with laughter and love. They had held off on that dream until Michael could find a better job, one that would afford them the life they dreamed of. When he had been appointed to work at the docks a few months ago, Hazel had known life was about to change. He had asked for her hand in marriage underneath a full moon. He had promised her the world, and Hazel had leapt at saying yes. The last few months had been a whirl of excitement. Michael had secured them a tenement home near the docks and had started his new position, insisting Hazel no longer needed to work at the railway station. Although their home was nothing fancy, it was theirs. 2 bedrooms, a rickety kitchen table, and a hole in the roof were going to be start of the life they had always dreamed of. Hazel stopped halfway towards the altar, and her eyes met Michael's, and she knew all her dreams were about to come true. She was certain there were handsomer men in Boston, richer as well, but a kinder man with a good soul she knew she would never find. "Are you ready?" Michael asked her, wearing his borrowed suit and a broad smile. Hazel nodded and moved towards him. "I'm ready." The pastor let out a heavy sigh of agitation. Clearly, the last place he wanted to be on a dreary day in Boston was officiating a wedding between what he presumed were barely more than children. "Great, now that everyone's ready, can we get this over with?" Not even the pastor's bad mood could sour Michael and Hazel's excitement. He didn't even bother with a sermon or a verse of encouragement for the young couple. He said the vows as they were written in the King James Bible before turning to Hazel and Michael with a questioning look. "I do," Michael said first. "Me too," Hazel laughed. I do. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the pastor said, snapping the Bible shut. "Go on, I want to close the chapel before the storm gets even worse." Hand in hand, the newlyweds rushed out of the church, eager to get to their new home. They pounced over puddles of mud, only to step in others, causing dirt to splatter over their neat clothes. But they didn't care. They ran all the way home, arriving completely soaked and chilled down to the bone. But as soon as they stepped into their small home with water seeping in through the crack in the roof, none of that mattered. Because after 3 years of dreaming about their future together, today it was finally going to start as Mr. and Mrs. Irvin. Michael framed Hazel's face with his cold hands and smiled warmly into her brown eyes. I don't think I've ever been as happy as I am right now. We've got the whole world at our feet, Hazel. Hazel smiled, seeing her future in his vivid blue gaze. I know, Michael, and we're going to conquer it together. I love you. I love you. Michael sighed before he noticed the time on the clock. I have to get to the docks for my shift, but I promise when I get home, we'll celebrate. Hazel pecked him on the cheek. Hurry, you'll be late. A few minutes later, Michael was out the door and rushing towards the docks. Hazel let out a contented sigh before she glanced down at the dress and laughed. It looked as if she had jumped into a puddle of mud with only the bodice free of dirt. At least she had something to do while Michael was at work. They might be dirt poor, living in a rickety tenement home, but Hazel knew that it was only a matter of time before God made all their dreams come true. A smile curved her mouth, especially the dreams of having a baby or two. Chapter 1. 1877, Boston, Massachusetts. It was almost time for Michael to come home, Hazel thought as she stirred the grits on the stove. The biscuits were already baked and being kept warm in the oven to be ready when Michael arrived. A smile lifted the corners of her mouth as she glanced out the window to the children playing outside in the street. She still couldn't believe that the beautiful girl with long black hair spilling down her back and eyes the color of the sea on a sunny day was her daughter. Hazel grabbed onto the side of the table when she suddenly felt a little unsteady. She hadn't been feeling well for a few weeks now, but hadn't bothered mentioning it to Michael. The dizzy spells came and went, and she was certain it was nothing to be concerned about. Barely a year after their wedding, God had blessed her and Michael with a beautiful little girl. Jessica brought so much joy to their lives that after only a few years, Hazel accepted that although she and Michael might never have the life they dreamed of on their rainy wedding day, they had so many blessings to be grateful for. After a few years, Michael had been promoted from unloading incoming vessels at the docks to construction of the new addition to the docks. It was hard and physical work, but it paid enough for Hazel to be able to stay home and take care of Jessica. Although they had prayed for God to bless them with a son after Jessica's birth, after 8 years, they were still waiting to be blessed with another child. Hazel tried not to think about it that much, but sometimes she would notice a distant look in Michael's eyes when he saw a little boy, and Hazel would know he had never stopped thinking about it. Hazel turned away from the window and began setting the table with a shake of her head. Because, although God had blessed them with a little girl, Jessica was not exactly what you would call girly. Hazel forced her to wear dresses when Jessica really preferred the pantaloons her friends wore, since all of them were boys. While all the other girls in the community began learning to cook and sew, Jessica spent her days playing ball and accepting every challenge her friends could think up for her. She was the epitome of a tomboy, and Hazel had long since given up trying to change her. She was the light of her father's eye, although Hazel knew that Michael still yearned to have a little boy. A noise outside drew Hazel's attention, and as soon as she saw what was going on, she dropped the knives and forks she was holding and rushed outside. If anyone else had walked past, they would have thought a couple of boys were embroiled in a skirmish. But the shortest one, on top of the bigger boy, pounding fists into his chest, was in fact Jessica, her little girl. Jessica Irvin, you get off Thomas right now, Hazel called out even as she rushed towards the group of children that had gathered to see who was going to win the fight. Jessica's hair fell out from underneath her cap, even as her hands lifted to pound into Thomas's chest once more. Hazel shook her head on a heavy sigh before she moved towards her daughter and plucked her off the poor boy by the scruff of her neck. It isn't ladylike of you to go around beating up boys, Hazel said, the anger clear in her voice. Jessica, who was about a foot shorter than Thomas, straightened her shoulders and shook her head. It isn't gentlemanly of Thomas to beat up on little Winston to steal his pocket money. Hazel frowned as she turned to see Winston, 2 years younger than Jessica, sobbing quietly as he held onto a coin. You were protecting Winston? Hazel asked, a little flabbergasted. Yes, ma'am, Jessica said indignantly. You said there were enough scoundrels in this world for 2 lifetimes. Since Thomas did a scoundrel thing, I taught him a lesson." Hazel sighed heavily as she turned to Thomas. She couldn't fault her daughter's reasoning, although she would give her an earful about propriety and proper behavior when they were alone. Thomas was clutching his nose, but fortunately nothing more than his ego seemed at all at risk of injury. "Thomas, you all right?" "Yes, ma'am." Thomas replied in a small voice before he turned and started towards the tenement apartment he called home. "Come, young lady, your father will have something to say about this," Hazel said firmly as she tugged Jessica home. As soon as they were inside, Hazel opened her mouth to give her daughter a proper speech, but instead a smile curved her mouth. "Although I don't approve of how you went about defending Winston, I'm proud of you." Jessica's eyes lit up with pride. "I told you I'll be a good big sister, didn't I?" Hazel laughed, ruffling her daughter's hair. "You go clean up. Your pa will be home any minute now." When Michael arrived home, Hazel didn't mention Jessica's skirmish with the boys. Instead, they spoke about Michael's day, and Jessica entertained them with tales of the neighborhood children. As soon as Hazel took a mouthful of her meal, she felt her tummy twist and pushed her plate away. "Aren't you hungry?" Michael asked after a while, noticing she hadn't even touched her food. Hazel shook her head. "I'll be fine, just not feeling well." Michael nodded before he continued with the rundown of his day. "Peter brought his son to the docks today." He shook his head on a smile. "Hazel, you should have seen how excited that little boy was to see the big ships that came into the harbor. One day I'll show my son those ships as well." Hazel felt the familiar stab of disappointment at not providing him a son, but when she glanced at the table and saw Jessica's face light up with joy, her heart sank. "I'll teach him how to play ball and how to fight," Jessica added with gumption. Feeling a little lightheaded and more than a little overwhelmed by her family's conversation, Hazel excused herself. She quickly rinsed the dishes before she went to bed. She wasn't feeling well, but she couldn't seem to put her finger on what was wrong. She was tired and a little nauseous. In the kitchen, she could hear Michael and Jessica talk about all the things they'd teach a baby brother. Hazel rolled onto her side and cried herself to sleep because she couldn't stand listening to how she had let both of them down by not falling pregnant again. Jessica had proved today that she would make for a wonderful big sister, and Michael had proved himself a good father over and over since Jessica's arrival. It was just a shame that God wasn't listening to their prayers. The following morning, when Hazel woke, she felt even worse. The mere whiff of food had her running for the outhouse. She was tired and her body ached, and she knew she was coming down with something. Michael gave her one look before he took down their tin of savings. "You go see a doctor today. You look right awful." Hazel smiled ruefully. "Thank you. I knew you were a man of compliments." Michael shook his head. "It's not even winter yet. We can't afford you making me and Jessica sick as well. Rather, let the doctor take a look and give you something for it." So once Michael was on his way to the docks, Hazel and Jessica headed to the doctor's surgery. She had a feeling it was only a cold, but agreed that it would be best if she had it taken care of before it got worse. As soon as they arrived at the doctor's rooms, Hazel felt silly for coming in. She was wasting their savings when she wasn't even sure of anything being amiss. A few dizzy spells and a loss of appetite did not an illness make. She kept reminding herself. She was surrounded by sick children, concerned mothers, and a few elderly people with miserable coughs. Quickly, she glanced at Jessica and wished she could tell her daughter to wait outside before she caught whatever the other patients had. By the time the doctor finally called Hazel into his examination room, they had been waiting for almost 2 hours. Jessica was becoming difficult. Hunger and boredom usually did that to an 8-year-old. The doctor wore spectacles that rode low on his nose, and he looked at her over the half-moon lenses. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" Hazel sighed. "I'm not sure, really. I've been having a few dizzy spells lately. Loss of appetite. Nothing specific. To be honest, I think I'm just wasting your time, but my husband insisted I make sure it isn't something to worry about." The doctor nodded before glancing at Jessica. "Your girl?" "Yes." Hazel smiled with pride, as she always did when someone asked her about Jessica. And only the one child? The doctor asked in a strange way. Hazel nodded. Yes, we haven't been blessed with more children since Jessica. Jessica chose that moment to pipe up. But we want more children. A brother, to be exact. The doctor chuckled softly. I can imagine. Mrs. Irvin, are you currently experiencing your monthlies? Hazel felt a bright red flush cover her cheeks and her chest. Such things weren't spoken of, especially not between strangers. She shook her head, too shy to answer. Interesting, the doctor said as he scribbled with his quill before meeting Hazel's gaze again. Do you remember the last time you experienced your monthlies? Hazel frowned, trying to remember. She had been so caught up with life in general that she didn't even realize that she had missed a couple of months. She mentioned the last time she remembered, and all color drained from her face. For such a long time, she had dreamed of having another child that she had completely pushed the thought aside. She slowly began shaking her head when she noticed the doctor nodding at her with a big smile. Come spring, I'd imagine, the doctor said with a broad smile as he stood up, clearly deciding further investigation wasn't necessary. Hazel got up, completely flummoxed, unable to form two words when Jessica suddenly began crying. Jessica, honey, what's wrong? Hazel asked, concerned. Are you going to die come spring? Jessica asked, sobbing. The doctor's booming laughter brought a smile to Hazel's face. Before Hazel could explain the doctor's reasoning, he bent over and met Jessica's gaze. Come spring, you're going to get a little brother, little girl. Jessica's face lit up with surprise even as Hazel felt laughter bubble from her throat. She had long ago let go of the dream of having another child, and now, after all these years, God was finally blessing them with another child. She nodded at her daughter before smiling at the doctor. Thank you, doctor. My pleasure, the doctor said warmly, before calling in his next patient. As soon as Hazel and Jessica were outside on the sidewalk, Jessica turned to her mother with a wide-eyed look. Can we stop by the docks and surprise Pa with the news? Hazel shook her head. The docks are no place for women. We'll go home and surprise him when he gets home. Together, mother and daughter walked home, planning how they were going to give Michael the news he had been hoping to hear for almost 8 years. Chapter 2. January 1878, Boston, Massachusetts. No one was more excited about the baby than Jessica. The first few days, she announced to anyone that would listen that she was going to have a baby brother. Regardless of Hazel and Michael's insistence that it might be either a girl or a boy, Jessica was convinced God was sending her the baby brother she had always wanted. As the months passed, the Irvin family prepared for the arrival of their baby. Blankets were bought, clothes sewed, and money saved for everything they would need once the baby arrived. By the time winter took Boston in its icy grasp, the Irvin family didn't even notice as they were counting down the days till spring, when the newest addition to their family would arrive. On a Saturday afternoon, Hazel and Michael were sitting by the wood stove trying to ward off the cold, while Jessica stood by the window watching as snow drifted to the ground, covering Boston with a beautiful white blanket. I hate winter, Jessica announced from the window in a sullen voice. Hazel smiled at Michael, knowing her daughter was only eager for spring to arrive. She turned to the window. You used to love winter, building snowmen and playing in the snow. That was before I realized it turned into a muddy sludge that only made us slip and get cold, Jessica said with maturity beyond her years. Michael chuckled beside Hazel. She's right, you know. Hazel shook her head with a smile. Patience is a virtue, and right now that snow isn't a muddy mess. It's a beautiful blanket just asking for company. Hazel turned to her husband with a mischievous look. We might be about to have our second child, but we're still young. Michael laughed as he stood up and scooped Jessica up from her position at the window. Time to build a snowman. With laughter in the air, Hazel followed them outside. They worked together, and in no time at all, they had built a beautiful snowman, complete with a carrot for a nose and sticks for arms. Michael let out a heavy sigh. Just a shame he'll be a muddy sludge in the morning. When Michael threw the first snowball, Jessica shrieked with laughter. One by one, they all made snowballs, and soon the snow expedition turned into a snow fight. Jessica was just about to heave the second ball at Michael when Hazel's loud cry made them turn to her in concern. Hazel felt warm liquid running down her legs, and even before uttering a single word, she knew what was wrong. The baby was coming. Michael rushed to her side, concern laced his voice. "It's too soon." "I know," Hazel said, shaking her head. "Michael, something's wrong." Michael slipped an arm around her waist and helped her inside. Once Hazel was settled on the bed, he instructed Jessica to stay with her while he went to fetch the doctor. The doctor arrived with Michael a short while later. Hushed whispers of concern were spoken as he tended to Hazel while Michael waited in the living room with Jessica. Whereas it had taken hours for Hazel to deliver her little girl, her little boy was born before the snowman turned to sludge. The doctor didn't have to say a single word. Both Hazel and Michael knew their little boy wouldn't live to see spring. He was too small, the winter too cold, and regardless of all their efforts, their little boy passed away after witnessing only a single sunrise. Silent tears were cried as Hazel wept over her baby boy. Michael turned to practicalities such as cooking dinner and arranging for a funeral, whereas Jessica mourned for her baby brother with heart-wrenching sobs. The funeral was held the following day. On a dreary day, much like the day of their wedding, Michael and Hazel laid their long-awaited son to rest. Jessica couldn't be consoled, even as Hazel felt her own heart ripped to shreds as the coffin was lowered into the ground. "Ma, I wanted him so much," Jessica sobbed when the funeral was over. Hazel wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulder, but didn't have the words to console her. The only consolation she could grasp at during this hard time was that God always had a reason for everything, although not even that now eased the ache in her heart. What reason could there be for taking a baby boy before he even witnessed a sunset? Michael was quiet and withdrawn, and although Hazel leaned on him for strength, she couldn't help but wish he would mourn. Mourning was a natural part of dealing with grief, and she was concerned that if he didn't deal with his grief, it would start eating at him sooner or later. The following day, it was hard to accept that life had to go on. Michael had to go back to work. Jessica needed to continue with her lessons, and regardless of the ache in her heart, Hazel knew she had to continue to be a mother to her daughter. Hazel continued with her chores, but every now and then she found herself imagining what it would have been like to have a baby in the house again. In the mornings, while Jessica had her lessons, Hazel wept in private because she knew she had to be strong for her daughter, who had taken her brother's death very hard. For a week, Jessica cried herself to sleep every night while her mother and father tried to console her. Hazel knew that Jessica was young and resilient and would soon get over grieving for the brother she only had for a day, but it was Michael she was concerned about. He returned to his construction job at the docks and retreated into himself a little more every day. By the time the second week rolled around, he barely spoke to Hazel at all. Hazel couldn't help but wonder if it had been the snow fight that had caused her baby to come early, but the doctor had made it clear that something else was wrong. He had seen it before when there was a heart defect or when something worse was wrong. Although the doctor insisted the early birth was no fault of Hazel's, she had a hard time accepting that. Whenever she tried to talk to Michael, he had somewhere else he had to be, or something else he had to do. It was as if time had stopped for Michael, and it didn't matter how Jessica and Hazel tried to cheer him up. Her husband's joy had been buried along with his son in the cemetery beside the small chapel where they had once said their vows. Chapter 3. April 1878, Boston, Massachusetts. Although spring had chased away the chill of winter, the chill hadn't yet left the Irvin home. Hazel grew more concerned over Michael with every passing day, but no matter how hard she tried to talk to him, he refused to discuss the son they had lost. Before that horrible day in January, Michael had hardly ever enjoyed a drink. But when he returned home from his shift after the funeral, he had brought with him a bottle of rum. Hazel didn't say anything or even comment on the drink, since she suspected he only wanted to forget about his heartache for the evening. But night after night, Michael kept returning with a bottle of rum. It was as if the smell of it had seeped into their bedclothes, as if it clung to the moldy walls and every item of furniture they owned. Hazel found herself preparing to confront Michael many times about the horrible habit he had become accustomed to. But every night when he returned home with that look of defeat in his gaze, Hazel promised herself that she would try again tomorrow. Although Michael was no longer the man she had fallen in love with, she was grateful that he never became violent with the drink. Instead, he would sit by the wood stove staring off into the distance, barely touching his food, as he drank a bottle a night, sip for sip. Most nights, he would stumble to bed without saying a single word to either Hazel or Jessica, while on other nights he would fall asleep right there at the table. Hazel tried to protect Jessica from her father's alcoholic preferences by explaining how hard he worked, but it was hard to protect an 8-year-old from an event that occurred every night. One night, Michael came home to find that Hazel had arranged for Jessica to play at a friend's so that she could talk to her husband. It had been 3 months since they lost the baby, and although Hazel would mourn him for the rest of her life, they needed to keep on living. Michael walked in at the usual time and took a seat at the table. Before he could pull the cork on the bottle of rum, Hazel sat down beside him and reached for the bottle. Michael's brows arched in surprise, but Hazel didn't let that deter her. "Michael, how would you feel if I drank the rum tonight and you took care of supper and Jessica?" Michael reached for the bottle, anger flashing in his gaze. "I've been working all day, Hazel. Don't start on me." Hazel pushed the bottle towards him before she let out a heavy sigh. "Michael, you've drunk your way through all our savings. You barely talk to me or Jessica, and when you do, you're so inebriated, we barely understand a single word you're saying." Michael shrugged as he took the first sip of rum. "It's a hard life." Hazel laughed wryly. "You're not the only one who buried a son. I buried him as well, and Jessica buried her brother. We're not going to get through this by drinking away our sorrows. We have to be there for each other. We have to talk about what happened to be able to put it in the past." Michael chuckled. "It is in the past. Don't you see me trying to forget him every night?" "We shouldn't forget. We should move on," Hazel pleaded. "We don't have money for a new coat for Jessica. We don't even have money for milk on most days. You're draining this family, Michael. I've let you have your grief and your rum for 3 months, but it's time you realized we are still a family." Michael grunted before grabbing the bottle and shoving himself away from the table. "I don't have to listen to this. I work for the money I earn. The least I can do is spend some of it. Maybe it's time you did something around here. It's not like you have a baby to take care of." Hazel flinched as if he had slapped her. Since Michael had never spoken a harsh word to her before, and to see the condescension in his eyes now hurt more than any blow of the hand ever could. "Michael?" Hazel asked, confused, as he started towards the door. Michael turned to her, the shadows and grief darkening his blue gaze. "I'm going to drink my rum somewhere where I don't have to explain myself. Good night." Hazel felt the tears burn the back of her eyes, but she said the words she believed he needed to hear. "I love you, Michael. I miss you." Her heart clenched when a tear slipped over her husband's cheek. "I loved him, Hazel. Although we only had him for a few hours, I loved him." With that, Michael walked out the door. Hazel took a few deep breaths before she left to collect Jessica. She told a white lie about Michael working a double shift before putting her daughter to bed. She didn't sleep a wink that night. All she could do was pray that God would help Michael, that he would help him put the grief behind him, as well as the drink. When morning came, he hadn't returned home. Hazel gave Jessica breakfast and sent her off to her lessons before she prayed again for strength and guidance. A knock on the door caught her off guard just before noon as she was sweeping the floors. Even before Hazel opened the door, she knew something horrible had happened. A shiver ran down her spine when she opened the door only to find 2 men in suits and top hats standing on the threshold with apologetic expressions. Hazel clutched her throat even as she spoke. "It's Michael, isn't it?" The one man nodded. "I'm afraid Mr. Irwin had an accident this morning during his shift. We express our sincerest apologies, Mrs. Irwin." Hazel felt her heart stop even as the first tear slid over her cheek. He's dead? It happened so fast, he would have felt no pain. Hazel nodded, but she couldn't seem to find anything to say. The man she had loved, had dreamed with, had built a life with, was now walking with God, and the only thing Hazel could think of was that she and Jessica were now all alone. The men in suits took care of the funeral arrangements and were forthcoming with giving Hazel a small amount of money as compensation. She wanted to laugh in their faces. How they ever imagined that money could replace her husband. On the day of the funeral, she wept, but in her heart she knew she had buried Michael on the day they had buried their son. Michael's colleagues had done a small collection to help Hazel and Jessica, and although it wasn't a large amount of money, Hazel realized that every penny would help. She hadn't worked in 8 years, and without Michael's income, it was only a matter of time before they were destitute. While Hazel soothed her daughter and accepted condolences, a few men stood over Michael's grave shaking their heads. "I feel for the widow. I can't imagine what she's going to do now," Pete McCabe said with a heavy sigh. "I worked with Michael for 5 years, and I still don't know he plummeted from the road to success into the depths of hell with drink." Andrew Tanner shook his head, glancing at Hazel, who was talking quietly with other funeral goers. Pete shrugged before turning to Andrew. "It was the death of his son. He told me on the day of the funeral that he might as well climb into the coffin then, because he couldn't face living after God robbed him of his only son." "Such a sad affair," Andrew sighed. "Do you think we should tell the widow about the accident?" Pete asked in a hushed whisper. Andrew quickly shook his head. "No, the last thing that poor woman needs now is to find out that he arrived drunk for his shift and took a fall because he couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. Let her believe what the suits told her." A tragic accident. "I wish I could have contributed more money for the collection," Pete said sadly, "but I got to take care of me wife and children." "We all do," Andrew agreed. "She might be all right for a few months yet. I'm sure the suits gave her something as well." "Probably did," Pete nodded. Together, they glanced at the widow and her daughter, knowing it would only be a matter of time before they were homeless and hungry. Boston was no place for a woman and a child alone, and regardless of everyone's well wishes, tomorrow everyone would forget about Michael Irvin and get on with their lives, leaving Hazel to fend for them herself. Chapter 4. May 1878, Boston, Massachusetts. On the day of Michael's funeral, Hazel had believed the money she had received from Michael's employer, along with the collection from his colleagues, would last her and Jessica at least a few months. But Hazel soon learned that after paying for coal, rent, and Jessica's lessons that the money wouldn't last. She used the money sparsely and began taking in laundry and accepting cleaning jobs in the mornings, while Jessica was at her lessons. It was Tuesday morning, and she was due to clean at the Smith home in the better part of town. A friend had secured her a position there, and although Hazel appreciated the work, she didn't appreciate the long walk. She arrived exactly on time and began cleaning the bedrooms that were hardly ever used. Mr. and Mrs. Smith owned a shipping company and had moved to Boston the year before. Although she had yet to meet Mr. Smith, Mrs. Smith was a dear old soul. Hazel often wondered if she hadn't just hired Hazel for the company. She finished the upstairs rooms and was soon headed downstairs to start in the parlor. She only cleaned for them once a week, whereas their permanent housekeeper took care of the cooking and cleaning on a full-time basis. "There you are, dear," Mrs. Smith said with a warm smile as soon as Hazel stepped into the parlor. "Good morning, Mrs. Smith." Hazel returned the smile. On the first day she had come to work for Mrs. Smith, the older woman had peppered Hazel with questions until she knew everything about Hazel. "How are you this morning?" Mrs. Smith asked, patting the seat beside her. In any other brownstone in Boston, it would be frowned upon, but it was clear Mrs. Smith didn't care what anyone thought of her. Hazel moved towards her and took a seat. "I'm doing well." Mrs. Smith cocked a brow with a questioning look. "I've seen beggars do better." A wry smile curved the corners of her mouth. Hazel attempted a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Although Mrs. Smith was her employer, She considered her a friend and confidant. I just can't seem to make ends meet, Hazel admitted ruefully before quickly shaking her head. Please don't think I'm asking for charity. I'm not. Mrs. Smith smiled and patted Hazel's hand. I know you wouldn't. It's not your way. Is it just the money, or is there something else bothering you? Hazel considered shaking her head, but Mrs. Smith was older and wiser, and perhaps she would have some advice. No, it's not, I'm afraid. It's Jessica. She seems to have withdrawn just like Michael did before. I don't know how to help her. After losing her father and her brother in such quick succession, it's like the light has just died inside her. A tear slipped over Hazel's cheek. I'm sorry. I'm sure you don't want to listen to my woes. Mrs. Smith's smile was endearing. My dear girl, do you think I don't care? I know exactly what you're going through. I lost my daughter. She was only 8 years old when the scarlet fever took her. Mr. Smith and I couldn't seem to get over the loss. She was everywhere we looked. The memories seemed to follow us around London. She let out a heavy sigh before summoning a smile. Do you know what you and your daughter need? You need a fresh start, one far away from here, a life out from under the shadow of your ghosts. Hazel frowned. But where? We have nowhere we can go. No family, and I'm not sure leaving Boston is the answer. Mrs. Smith patted Hazel's hand with renewed excitement. Have you heard of the matrimonial times? Hazel frowned. The words ignited a memory, but she couldn't exactly place it. I think so. Well, let me tell you about it. Men are heading west faster than we can build roads out there. There's gold in the west, business to be done, and big money in ranching and merchandise. But you see, the problem with the expansion to the west is there are no women. Hazel's frown deepened. So you suggest I take my little girl to an uncivilized frontier in the hopes I find a man? Mrs. Smith chuckled, shaking her head. Of course not. These men, cowboys and prospectors and such, place advertisements in the matrimonial times for wives. You see, you can choose with which man you correspond. After some time, if you feel you have a connection, you might consider traveling west to become what we call a mail-order bride. Hazel laughed at the absurdity of it all. I'm not sure picking a husband from a catalog is the right answer for me. Perhaps, Mrs. Smith agreed before a sad smile settled on her face. But sometimes there isn't a right answer. Sometimes you have to grab the only option you have. Don't let that little girl follow in her father's footsteps, Hazel. You can still give her a happy childhood, but only if you leave Boston and the horrible memories it holds for her. Hazel sighed heavily. She couldn't fathom marrying again, but perhaps Mrs. Smith was right. Where do I get a hold of the matrimonial times? Any news agency, I suppose, Mrs. Smith said, reaching into her pocket. She dropped a few coins in Hazel's hand. The house is clean enough. Go on and find yourself a husband. Just promise me you'll keep working for me until you leave. Hazel thanked Mrs. Smith graciously for her generosity before putting the cleaning things away. She still couldn't imagine finding a husband or moving away from Boston, but the image of Jessica's downtrodden expression came to mind, and she knew she had to do something. Chapter 5. Hazel stopped by the news agency on her way home. She bought a copy of the Matrimonial Times and tucked it into her purse before she rushed home to her tenement on the other side of town. She had another hour before Jessica would be done with lessons and preferred to engage in this wild goose chase without Jessica having to know anything at all about it. As soon as she arrived home, she made herself a cup of tea and opened the windows and the front door to allow the cool spring breeze to clear out the musty smell before taking a seat at the kitchen table. Taking a deep breath, Hazel opened the paper and began reading the advertisements placed by men looking for wives. Soon she was engrossed by the tales of men looking for love, partnership, or companionship on their vast and lonely ranches. As she read, she began forming an idea of what she was looking for in her own mind. The list grew longer by the minute. Subconsciously, Hazel knew she was creating a list of impossible expectations, only to have an excuse for not writing to any of the eligible men. But on the very last page, her breath caught. She ticked off the items on her list, and the man in question met every single criterion she had formed, except one: he didn't live in Colorado. Hazel had hoped if she went through with this that she would find a man in Colorado. Jessica had always loved the snow, and she couldn't imagine relocating her daughter anywhere without snow in which to play during the cold winter months. She pushed thoughts of Colorado aside and took a deep breath before she read over the advertisement again. Rancher Joe Spencer, seeking wife to complete his family. Joe Spencer has loved and lost. At the age of 35, he is ready to find love again. He owns a vast spread of land in Texas where he breeds cattle and on which he is raising his 5-year-old son. Although Joe understands that any woman might be hesitant raising another woman's child, he wishes to give his son the mother he so desperately needs. A man of even temper and sober habits, Joe assures any woman willing to write to him that she will be rewarded with honesty and generosity. A man of substantial wealth, Joe can provide for his family whilst offering his wife a lifestyle many only dream of. Although the ranching life might be hard, especially during the hotter summer months, Joe looks forward to spending the cooler months with his family. If you are an even-tempered woman of childbearing age, looking to find love and willing to raise Joe's son as your own, Joe is looking forward to hearing from you. All within the advertisement that have Hazel reason for pause was the fact that Joe was in Texas. Otherwise, Joe Spencer sounded like the solution to all her problems. No longer would she have to clean or do other people's laundry. She would live on a ranch instead of a musty and moldy tenement home, which she couldn't afford. They might not have snow in winter, but Jessica would finally have the brother she had always dreamed of. Hazel glanced at the clock and calculated that she had a short while left before she needed to collect Jessica. Her mind swirled with reasons for not even attempting to write to Joe Spencer, but Mrs. Smith's words kept resounding in her mind. If she didn't do something, she might lose Jessica as well. Hazel glanced towards the bedroom where her son had died, to the table where Michael had drunk away his sorrows, and she knew that she had to do something. Before she could change her mind, she reached for a quill and a sheet of paper and began writing the letter she hoped would change her life. Dear Mr. Spencer, I too have loved and lost. I never expected to find myself in a position writing to a stranger, but I believe we are two grieving souls looking for redemption for our children. Your son needs a mother, and my daughter needs a father. After losing her baby brother Jessica, 8 years old, is still yearning for a brother. Boston has brought us nothing but grief and bad memories, and although I don't expect leaving will heal our broken hearts, I do believe the hope of a new future is what we need. I am an even-tempered woman of the age of 29. I believe myself to be kind, loving, and gentle, and a good mother to my daughter. If given the opportunity, I will raise your son as my own. Although I realize you are looking for love, I should admit I am a little hesitant to fall in love again. After losing my husband, I haven't given it much thought, but perhaps through correspondence we might explore the possibility further. If you believe that I might be the woman you are looking for, I look forward to hearing from you. If not, I wish you and your son all of the best and God's richest blessings. Yours truly, Hazel Irvin, Boston, Massachusetts. Hazel read the letter over and almost crumbled it, but quickly placed it in an envelope. It might not be perfect, it might not be what Joe Spencer wanted to hear, but Hazel prided herself on honesty. After grabbing her coat, Hazel tucked the letter into her pocket and left to fetch Jessica from her lessons. She dropped the letter in a mailbox on her way and said a prayer for God to guide her to her fate. She glanced around the busy streets of Boston and had a feeling for the first time in her life that Boston was not the place of her future. Perhaps Mrs. Smith had been right. Perhaps sometimes we weren't just offered one chance at happiness. Perhaps sometimes we were offered happiness twice. Just maybe Hazel would find that happiness again. But more than anything, she wished Jessica would find that happiness. Although she still quietly mourned both Michael and their son, Hazel knew that she needed to think of Jessica and her future now. She wasn't sure if she would ever hear from Joe Spencer, but if she did, she would accept it as a sign that God was steering her towards her fate. Chapter 6. June 1878, Boston, Massachusetts. It was a lovely summer's day in Boston. Although Hazel had learned to love the long, cool winters, she enjoyed the warmth. It was as if, after a winter that had only brought her sorrow and loss, God had finally pushed away the dark clouds to allow a little sun into her life. Not even Jessica's despondent mood could break Hazel's good mood this morning. She knew it had more to, with the letter in her handbag, than it did with the weather. But Hazel pushed the thought aside as she ascended to the brownstone in which Mr. and Mrs. Smith lived. She wasn't due to clean for Mrs. Smith today, but she did need some friendly advice. Regardless of their different stations in life, Mrs. Smith had become a dear friend to Hazel over the last few months. She lifted the brass knocker and waited for the housekeeper to open. Mrs. Plum, a heavily set elderly lady, cocked a brow. More than once during the last few months, Mrs. Plum had made her disapproval known over Hazel's friendship with Mrs. Smith. "You're not working today," Mrs. Plum informed rudely. Hazel smiled beneath the housekeeper's intimidating gaze. "I know, Mrs. Plum. I was coming to pay Mrs. Smith a visit. Is she available?" Before the housekeeper could answer, Hazel heard Mrs. Smith's voice from inside the house. "Hazel, is that you?" Mrs. Plum let out a heavy sigh of resignation. "I guess you'd best come in. You'd probably be expecting tea as well." Mrs. Smith smiled at the housekeeper. "That would be lovely, Mrs. Plum." Mrs. Plum hurried away, but not before giving Hazel a stern look of disapproval. Hazel flinched beneath her gaze, but Mrs. Smith just laughed. "Don't pay her any mind. Come, let's sit in the parlor. It's such a lovely morning. I want to bask in the sun." Hazel smiled as she followed Mrs. Smith into the parlor. The sun's rays reached through the windows, touching almost every corner of the parlor. Hazel took a seat and turned to Mrs. Smith with a questioning look. "I hope I'm not interrupting your day." "Nonsense. Mr. Smith headed out to the docks early this morning, and I'm all but starved of conversation. I was invited to a luncheon by the ladies of the Ton, but who has time to discuss dresses and the upcoming debutante balls when there are people starving in the streets?" She shook her head, clearly disgusted at the thought. "What brings you here, my dear?" Hazel drew in a deep breath. "I received this in the mail yesterday." Mrs. Smith reached for the letter Hazel held out just as Mrs. Plum arrived with a tea tray. "Thank you, Mrs. Plum," Hazel said with a smile, but Mrs. Plum just huffed before hurrying away. Hazel prepared their tea while Mrs. Smith read the letter. When she was finally done, she turned to Hazel with a beaming grin. "Hazel, this is the best news." Hazel frowned, shaking her head. "No, it isn't. It's horrible. He wants me to come to Texas and marry him. I don't even know him. What if he's mean and hateful and takes to the bottle like Michael did?" Mrs. Smith smiled kindly and reached for Hazel's hand. "Hazel, it's been 3 months since you wrote to him the first time. You admitted yourself that he sounded like a wonderful man. For the last 3 months, you've been walking around as if a smile had taken permanent residence on your face, and now that he's proposed, you're having second thoughts." Hazel sighed. "It's not that I'm having second thoughts. It's just that I don't even know him. It was all well and good when we were just corresponding, but taking a train to Texas is another matter. I can't just pack Jessica up and tell her I found her a new father." "And a brother," Mrs. Smith added with a broad grin. "My dear, I love you as the daughter I once lost, but you and I both know that there is no one in Boston who would take on a widow and her daughter, especially not a pair from the tenements. Although it's a fact I hate more than anything, this world is filled with snobs, and not one of those snobs will take a second look at you. You have no dowry and no family with connections. If you want to find a new life for yourself and Jessica, this is it." Mrs. Smith waved the letter in the air. "I know it feels strange. I know you must be horribly frightened. But Hazel, God has a hand in everything we do. Do you not think it was God's work that you wrote to Joe in the first place? Or that he replied? He must have received dozens of letters, but he chose you. Joe Spencer had faith in you. Isn't it time you had faith in him?" Hazel glanced out the window at the beautiful day outside and wished the answer was easier. She was so afraid of leaving Boston and the memories of Michael and her baby son behind, only to find a worse fate in Texas. A tear slipped over her cheek and she shook her head. "I just don't know if I can do it. I don't love him." Mrs. Smith chuckled softly. "My dear girl, You were lucky to fall in love and marry at a very young age. Not all of us are that lucky. Did I ever tell you how I came to be Mrs. Smith?" Hazel shook her head. "No, you didn't." "Well, you see, I was quite a handful even as a young girl. No man would look at me twice, thinking I'd only cause them headaches. I suppose they were right in a way." She chuckled softly. "When I turned 28, my father arranged for a match. I was abhorred at the thought of marrying a man I didn't know. On my wedding day, I didn't speak 2 words to Mr. Smith, but with time I came to like him. Once I did so, we became friends." A dreamy smile settled on her face as she reminisced. "I still remember thinking there can be worse things than being married to a friend. But before I knew it, I was falling in love. Sometimes it takes a while, Hazel, but I can assure you the love I feel for Mr. Smith is no less than the love you had for your Michael." Hazel sighed. "What if I don't even like him?" "You will. You've been telling me about his letters every week with such fondness that I just know you will. Go to Texas, Hazel. Go find your happily ever after, and with time, I'm sure you'll find love as well." Hazel searched Mrs. Smith's face and wondered if she was right. This morning she had been elated by the letter, but too hesitant to make a decision. She was flattered that Joe Spencer had asked for her hand in marriage, but terrified about saying yes. But now, after listening to Mrs. Smith's reasoning, Hazel had to admit to herself that she didn't really have a choice. They barely had any money left, and Jessica wasn't any better than a few months ago. Marrying a stranger might not be what she had in mind, but right now it was the only option she had if she wanted to see her daughter smile again. Perhaps with time, she might even smile at her new husband as well, with love. Chapter 7. 2nd July 1878, Fort Worth, Texas. For the last 10 days, Hazel and Jessica had been cooped up in a train heading south. Hazel couldn't even count the number of times she had debated whether boarding the train to Texas had been the right decision. But Jessica enjoyed pointing out interesting sights on the constantly changing landscape. Hazel hoped she had been right. Hazel had expected her daughter to be reticent at the thought of leaving Boston. But as soon as Hazel explained that she would have a brother at her new home on the ranch, Jessica's excitement couldn't be contained. Jessica didn't care about leaving Boston or that her mother was practically marrying a stranger. All she cared about was finally having a little brother to play with. Hazel was a little more cautious. Over the last few days, she had so many nightmares on the train. Nightmares about Joe Spencer being a horrible man who beat on his son. Other nightmares about him drinking and becoming violent. Every time she woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, debating abandoning the train journey at the next stop. But her reality wasn't easy to face. She had no money, no family, and right now Joe Spencer was her only chance at offering her daughter the life she had always dreamed of giving her. Hazel slipped an arm around Jessica's shoulders as the conductor announced that the train would be stopping in Fort Worth in less than an hour. Together, mother and daughter watched out the window as the landscape changed once again into flat lands and dusty fields. It was so different from the lush mountainous vegetation of Boston, the heat already palpable inside the train. Regardless of it being summer in Boston, it was clear that Texas summers were much harsher. The train's whistle sounded as they pulled into a station. Hazel glanced at Jessica with a smile. "Ready?" Jessica nodded eagerly. "Will my brother be here?" Hazel couldn't help but laugh. "I'm not sure. Best behavior, remember?" Together they disembarked the train, and after collecting their luggage, they waited on the platform. For the first time, Hazel realized she had no idea of Joe Spencer's appearance. Fear clutched at her heart even as Jessica began tugging on her hand. "Ma, is that them?" Hazel turned to see a tall man standing to one side, with a hat riding low over his brow. Even with the distance between them, Hazel could see his eyes were a clear green. They reminded Hazel of the color of the ocean right before a storm. He had a strong face, a chiseled jaw, and thick brown brows guarding his eyes. Beside him stood a little boy of about 6. The boy had his father's green eyes and brown hair, but his nose was scrunched up, a few freckles dotted on the tip as he curiously looked up and down the platform. Hazel couldn't stop the smile that formed on her face, even as her heart clenched in her chest. He was simply adorable. ruddy, petulant, and curious, just like every little boy should be. "Ma," Jessica persisted, tugging at her arm again. But Hazel didn't answer. Just then the tall man met her gaze. His green eyes searched her face, and Hazel felt her heart skip a beat, even as her cheeks turned rosy. She didn't hear Jessica's nagging, because suddenly the man was moving towards her. Hazel swallowed past the anxious lump in her throat and took a deep breath, wondering if the handsome man could indeed be Joe Spencer. He stopped directly in front of her, his mouth tugged into a charming grin. "Hazel and Jessica, I hope?" Jessica stuck out her hand first. "I'm Jessica, and this is my ma, Hazel. Are you Mr. Spencer?" Joe chuckled at her forwardness before shaking her hand. "I am indeed, and this here is Stephen." Jessica turned to the little boy with a wide-eyed gaze. 7%. Hazel watched as her little girl stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the boy with so much love. "I'm your big sister." The boy stepped back, clearly not appreciating the strange girl's directness. But Hazel knew it would only be a matter of time before he warmed to his new sister. Hazel turned to meet Joe's eyes and cleared her throat. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Spencer. And you never mentioned how attractive you were in your letters. I must say it warms a man's heart to know he has a beautiful wife." Hazel felt her blush deepen even more. "Thank you. Shall we get on our way?" "The pastor will be waiting," Joe said as he lifted her and Jessica's carpet bags as if they weighed no more than a feather. The bags had been a farewell gift from Mrs. Smith, who said she wouldn't need them again. Together, the four strangers started towards the wagon that waited at the end of the platform. Once everyone was inside, Hazel took a deep breath to calm herself. It had been arranged that they would marry on her arrival. It wouldn't be right for a woman to accompany a man to a ranch house unmarried. They arrived at the chapel a short while later. Unlike the stone chapel in which she had wed Michael, this was a timber-frame chapel. Some of the slats were faded and split with age and weather, but no one seemed to care except for Hazel. Joe stopped the wagon and helped the children out before holding out a hand to Hazel. Her tummy flipped upside down as soon as their hands touched. Hazel quickly pushed the feeling aside as guilt rushed over her. She had never been attracted to any man other than Michael, and she had a feeling of betraying him by marrying Joe. Since it was too late to change her mind now, she followed Joe and their children into the chapel where the pastor was already waiting. Regardless of their situation, the pastor presented a wonderful sermon about patience, kindness, love, and consideration being the four cornerstones of marriage. By the time he said the vows, Hazel's heart was racing a mile a minute. She turned and looked into Joe's green gaze and wondered if she would ever love him in the way she had loved Michael. The children sat quietly in the first pew as Hazel promised to honor Joe for the rest of her life. When the pastor announced them husband and wife, Hazel couldn't help but wonder if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She turned and looked at Jessica, who was smiling and knew she had done it for her daughter. Beside Jessica sat Stephen. He hadn't said a single word since their arrival, and his downtrodden expression made Hazel's heart yearn. Did he not want his father to marry, or was he simply disappointed in his father's choice of wife? Hazel pushed the thoughts aside when Joe suddenly reached for her hand and pressed a kiss to the top of her knuckles. "Fort Worth welcomes you, Mrs. Spencer. May you only find love and happiness here." Hazel knew he was only being kind and smiled. "I hope so, too." "Shall we go home now?" Jessica jumped up and rushed to their sides. "To the ranch?" Joe chuckled. "Yes, to the ranch. Have you ever been on a ranch before, Jessica?" Jessica shook her head. "No, but Ma says there are horses and chickens and sometimes even cows on a ranch." "That's right, and we have a little of each, don't we, Stephen?" Joe asked, turning to his son, whose gaze remained determinedly fixed on the floor, clearly not approving of strangers taking up residence in his home. Chapter 8. Joe stopped at the merchant store in Fort Worth, and Hazel couldn't help but feel her tummy rumble at the sight of fresh cheese and the like that she had not been able to afford to buy back in Boston for quite some time. They were all eventually back in the wagon, which was now loaded with purchases, and headed out to Joe's ranch. "It'll take us about 2 hours to get back to the ranch. You're welcome to nap if you'd like, Joe said with a charming smile as they started out of town on a dirt road. Thank you. I must say I am a bit tired after the train journey, Hazel replied before glancing over her shoulder at the children. Stephen had yet to talk to Jessica. It seemed not to have bothered Jessica too much that her new brother hadn't said 2 words to her. As the road climbed and fell, Hazel found sleep the furthest from her mind. The landscape was so different from the northeast part of the country where they had lived. There were dusty flats before rocks seemed to tower out of nothing before it gave way to rivers carving their way through the countryside. It was rugged, dusty, and absolutely breathtaking. Hazel and Jessica were both completely enthralled by their surroundings. When an eagle swept low past them, Hazel gasped in awe, just as Jessica did the first time she saw a mule approaching from the opposite direction. It was new and exciting, and Hazel couldn't help but feel that coming to Texas had been the right decision. Her daughter was excited for the first time in months, and instead of the sullen expression that had become commonplace on her pretty face, there was now a beaming smile. The next 2 hours flew by as both mother and daughter were captivated by everything around them. By the time Joe turned the wagon onto a smaller dirt road, Hazel had completely forgotten that she had been tired. Here she is. I know she's not much, but she's home, Joe said with a shrug. Suddenly there were fences on either side of the road and cattle grazed, completely oblivious to their arrival. Hazel gasped at the sheer size of the cattle before being taken aback by the size of Joe's herd. Are all these cows yours? Joe chuckled. Cattle. Yep, they're mine. Got another herd over that hill. Grazing's better there this time of year. But these are the steers I'm hoping to take to auction come winter. You have more? Jessica cried out from behind them. It's a big herd, Joe admitted. Hard work, too. The dirt road carried on for a while, curving around an outcrop of rocks before a house suddenly came into sight. It was a large cabin made of timber with a few large trees towering around it. It was the size of the entire block of tenement homes in Boston. Hazel shook her head in awe. It's big. It's big enough, Joe admitted. 4 bedrooms, a kitchen and a fireplace for winter, and a wraparound porch. Thought it might be a good idea. That way I get to watch the sunrise and the sunset. Joe smiled at Hazel, and she felt her tummy flip upside down again. She quickly cleared her throat and turned back to the house, noticing the outbuildings. A large barn stood a short distance from the house. A chicken coop held position beside what looked like a kitchen garden, and the outhouse wasn't far off. It was more than Hazel could ever have imagined. A few horses grazed close to the house, and just as the wagon came to a stop, a wolf rushed past the horses and took up a terribly frightening noise. Jessica all but jumped onto Hazel's lap in pure terror, even as Stephen uttered his first sound for the day. He won't bite, unless I tell him to. Stephen jumped off the wagon and rubbed the wolf's ears, while Hazel and Jessica both remained frozen in place. Lobo might seem intimidating, but he won't do you no harm, Joe said, climbing off the wagon. Got him from a Mexican that came through when Stephen was just a cub himself. Lobo's pa was a Mexican wolf, but his ma was dog. He's a gentle soul but helps keep other wolves at bay. Not believing that the wolf was harmless at all, Hazel shook her head. I won't let my daughter be mauled by a wolf, Joe chuckled. You're not afraid, are you, Jessica? Jessica broke free from her mother's grasp and into Joe's waiting arms as he helped her down. He called the wolf over, and Hazel couldn't help but flinch when the wolf rushed at Jessica. Lobo, this is Jessica, Joe said in a gentle voice. Before Hazel could warn her daughter off, the wolf dog rolled onto its back, tongue lolling to one side as Jessica laughed and scratched his belly. See, he's just a pup, Joe chuckled, holding out his hand to Hazel. Hazel tentatively climbed out of the wagon, her heart still racing as Jessica petted Lobo. Stephen had already rushed towards the house, and Hazel couldn't help but wonder why the little boy seemed so upset. Not feeling as if it was her place to ask, she helped Joe carry their luggage and purchases inside. The cabin was even larger on the inside than it had seemed from the outside. Hazel had heard of Mexicans coming into Texas, but it was her first experience of Mexican influence inside Joe's house. Colorfully weaved rugs covered the floor. The kitchen was large, with a table dominating the center for family meals. The fireplace was large enough to roast a pig whole. "We're in Texas. We do things big," Joe said with a smile, noticing her shocked expression. "I can see that," Hazel commented as she turned to Joe. "Your home is amazing." "Our home," Joe corrected with a warm smile before taking her hand. "Come, let me show you to your room." Hazel's heart jumped into her throat, remembering she was now Joe's wife. But instead of the main bedroom, he showed her to a bedroom across from Stephen's. It was large enough for 2 beds and a wardrobe, larger than her entire home in Boston. She stepped into the room, shaking her head at the breathtaking view through the window. "Joe, this is perfect," Jose shrugged. "I thought you might want to share with Jessica, for now." Hazel quickly nodded. "Thank you. I'll leave you to unpack and wash up after your journey. But before I go, I just want to say I'm mighty happy you came, Hazel." Hazel felt a blush color her cheeks. "I think I am too." Joe smiled at her, really smiled for the first time. He was the most attractive man Hazel had ever met, his height and broad shoulders only adding to his appeal. Her breath caught before she quickly turned around and opened her carpet bag. "Come, Jessica, the sooner we unpack, the sooner you can go and explore." Jessica jumped onto the bed and tossed all her belongings out before turning to her mother with a petulant frown. "You don't expect me to wear dresses here, do you? No one is going to care if I wear pantaloons on a country ranch." Hazel let out a heavy sigh. "Could we at least settle in before we start arguing over your choice of clothing?" Jessica pouted. "All right, Ma, but please consider it. Only if you wash up like a good girl and help me unpack first," Hazel said with a cocked brow, although she already knew sooner or later she was bound to give in. Chapter 9. After unpacking and taking a long-desired bath, Hazel was ready to face her new husband. She found him in the kitchen, stirring a pot, and couldn't help but be slightly surprised. "You're cooking?" Hazel asked, peeking into the pot to see a rich vegetable stew, its aroma making her mouth water. Joe nodded. "Thought you might be tired after your journey." "It isn't much, just stew." Hazel shook her head. "It smells delicious after living on train meals for a week." A frown creased her brow as she realized Jessica was nowhere in sight. "Jessica? She's outside, exploring. Don't worry, I've got her in my sights. She's right there by the chicken coop." "Never seen anyone so fascinated with chickens before," Joe chuckled. Hazel moved towards the window and saw her daughter standing beside the chicken coop, having a conversation with the hens. A smile curved her mouth as a sense of calm settled over her. She hadn't known if Jessica would enjoy living on a ranch, but clearly the hens already made up for the friends Jessica had left behind in Boston. On the other side of the yard, sitting in front of the barn, was Stephen, all alone. Her heart ached for the little boy who seemed so quiet and lonely, but she didn't mention her thoughts to Joe. They barely knew each other, and it wasn't her place to comment on his son. "Can I do anything to help?" "Sure," Joe said. "You can set the table if you like. You'll find plates and such in that cupboard." Hazel felt a little intimidated by the large kitchen and promised herself that she would acquaint herself with the layout tomorrow. Once she found the plates, she set the table and then took a wander through the house to explore it just a little. It was so different from the home she had shared with Michael for so many years. Despite the size, this house felt welcoming. The warm breeze sneaked in through the windows, bringing with it the sense of summer. Hazel took a deep breath before letting out a contented sigh. "It's your place now too, Hazel. If there's anything you'd like to change, please feel free." Hazel turned to find Joe standing behind her. "Really, to be honest, I don't think I'd change a thing. It's a wonderful home." Joe chuckled before dragging a hand through his thick, bark-brown hair. "I'm sure with time you'll change a thing or two, especially the kitchen. I've never been much of a cook, but I taught myself when I needed to." He stumbled over his words before quickly turning away. Hazel understood what he meant and simply nodded. "Shall I call the children?" "Yep, you can. Tell him to wash up too. Stephen always forgets," Joe said, shaking his head before heading to the kitchen. Hazel stepped out on the porch and called to the children. Jessica rushed towards her, her cheeks pink with excitement. "Ma, did you see the hens and the cows and the horses?" Hazel laughed. I did. I'll take a closer look tomorrow. You best be careful. You're not used to these types of animals. You might get hurt. Jessica laughed. Ma, they're just animals. I'll be fine. Jessica rushed into the house, past her to wash up, and Hazel waited on the porch as Stephen slowly made his way from the barn. Hi, Stephen. Your pa says you need to remember to wash up, Hazel said in a gentle voice. Stephen barely looked up at her. He just nodded and walked past her into the house. Hazel waited another moment and quickly said a prayer. Lord, please give me the patience and the kindness to be the mother he needs. Everyone sat down at the table, and although Joe and Hazel were talking about menial things, getting to know each other as they ate, Jessica and Stephen barely said a word. When their plates were empty, Joe turned to his son. Stephen, tomorrow you can show Jessica around the ranch, just not too far from the house. I'm sure she's dying to see more. Jessica nodded eagerly. Can I get the eggs from the chicken coop? Joe chuckled. I'm sure you can. Stephen will show you how. Might get bitten by a rattler. It's summer and they're hunting, Stephen said in the angry voice of a little boy. It was the first words he'd spoken since their arrival, and Hazel couldn't help but feel as if he didn't want them there. Jessica flinched before sticking out her chin. I'll bite him first, Joe chuckled. Stephen knows what to do when he sees a rattler. Don't you, son? Stephen shrugged, making it clear he wasn't going to look out for Jessica. By the time the dishes were washed and the sun had set in the west, Jessica was just as sullen as Stephen. Hazel had looked forward to Jessica finally having the brother she had dreamed of, but clearly her daughter wasn't very impressed with her angry and withdrawn brother. Time for bed, Joe announced, clapping his hands together. Without a word, Stephen walked to his room and shut the door. Jessica turned to Hazel with a sad expression. Hazel forced a smile. Come on, young lady, let's get you tucked into your new bed. After saying their prayers, Hazel kissed Jessica. I know it's all still very new, but in no time at all, you and Stephen will be playing as if you've always been brother and sister. Jessica smiled hopefully. You really think so, Ma? Without a doubt, Hazel promised, although she already had her doubts. She blew out the candle before heading to the kitchen. It was too early for her to turn in, but she couldn't help but feel anxious about being alone with Joe for the first time. I made you coffee. If you like, we could sit out on the porch, Joe offered. Hazel nodded and followed him out onto the porch. Instead of the suffocating heat that had been stifling earlier, there was now a cool breeze, and the landscape was simply breathtaking in the moonlight. They sat down, and for a while, and neither said a word. Joe finally broke the silence. I'm sorry about Stephen. You should excuse him. He had his heart set on having a brother someday. Joe sighed. I probably should have waited. But your letters. Joe trailed off and turned to Hazel. Their eyes met and she knew exactly what he meant. From his first letter, she had felt something, almost as if God was nudging her in his direction. She nodded and a smile curved her mouth. Well, Jessica is over the moon. She's always wanted a brother. In fact, I don't even recall her having any girlfriends back in Boston. She might surprise Stephen yet. Joe shrugged, hopefully. Jessica isn't your usual girl. She hates dresses, and I've had to get her out of more than one tumble with the boys back home. She's always been a little rough and tumble. Joe chuckled, shaking his head. I can only imagine how disappointed you must be. Hazel caught herself laughing. At first, maybe, but now that's who she is, and I love her for it. She never steps down from a challenge, and she doesn't have a single ounce of fear in her bones. That frightens me more than anything. Sounds like quite a girl. I'm sure she's going to love it on the ranch if she doesn't mind getting some dust on her dresses. Hazel sighed. That's the other thing, Joe. Would you mind if she wore pantaloons around the ranch? She's never been fond of dresses. I made her wear one on the train. She can wear whatever she's comfortable with. I want you both to be comfortable here, Joe said with a smile, and their eyes met again. Hazel couldn't help but remember Mrs. Smith's words about becoming friends before falling in love. There wasn't a single doubt in her mind that she could be friends with Joe, but as for falling in love, Michael came to mind, and Hazel quickly broke their gaze. She wasn't ready to be anything more than friends just yet. Chapter 10. 23rd July 1878, Fort Worth, Texas. Hazel stood in the kitchen late afternoon and caught herself returning to the window every few minutes. This had been happening more and more over the last 2 weeks. The first week after their arrival in Texas, Hazel had been shy and reserved towards Joe. But the handsome rancher's charm had soon coaxed her out of her shell. They could talk for hours on end about anything and everything, but Hazel enjoyed it most when he spoke about the ranch. He spoke with such passion that it was hard not to also feel passionate about cattle. The only problem was that she caught herself watching him more and more. The way he worked with the animals, the way he was with his son, and right now, the way he was with her daughter. Joe held the horse's halter and patiently explained to Jessica about every aspect of the horse. He allowed her to rub the horse down, explaining that you didn't ride an animal you didn't respect. If you wanted an animal to respect you, it was most important to first respect the animal. Her heart swelled in her chest when Joe suddenly turned and looked directly at her. Hazel's breath caught as she quickly turned away from the window. It didn't matter how much she denied it, she liked Joe. She liked him as a friend, and if she was completely honest, she liked him a little more than a friend. But every time he returned her smile or held her gaze, she felt a dark cloud pushing down on her with guilt. She had promised to love Michael until the day she died, and although Michael had been gone for months now, Hazel still couldn't help but feel guilty. About losing the baby, about Michael's consequent demise, and more recently about being happy living under another man's roof. The sweet scent of cookies filled the air, and a smile curved Hazel's mouth. She moved towards the oven and pulled the fresh batch of sugar cookies out before placing them on the table to cool. She knew the scent would soon coax Stephen inside, just as she had planned. Although the boy was still quiet and reserved, Hazel had decided to fatten him up a little. She wasn't sure if his skinny build was due to running around on the farm or because of Michael's poor talent in the kitchen. Regardless, very time she baked, he would rush inside and actually spend a few minutes talking to her while he relished in the freshly baked spoils. She wiped her hands and moved back to the window. Her heart jumped into her throat when she watched as Joe carefully helped Hazel onto the horse's bare back. Just then the back door opened. Like make me clothes? Yes, I've made all Jessica's clothes, Hazel clarified. Stephen nodded. Please, ma'am, my breeches are growing a bit small. Pa says it's because I shoot out faster than a weed. Hazel couldn't help but laugh. Breeches it is. Last question. Are you angry that your pa invited me and Jessica to come and stay? It was the first time she had approached the subject of Stephen's blatant dislike of Jessica. He thought for a long while before he finally met Hazel's gaze. You're all right, I suppose. Hazel wished she could push further, but he was only 6 years old, and it wouldn't be right for her to reenact the Spanish Inquisition. Well then, that's 3 questions answered. Dig in. She watched as he scoffed down a few cookies and then headed outside with a few more. Hazel followed him outside, relieved to see Jessica with both feet safely on the ground again. Why don't you go put her in the stable for tomorrow? Then we can work with her again. Jessica hesitated for a moment before she stepped forward and confidently reached for the horse's halter. Hazel couldn't help but smile with pride. Her little girl was brave, and it was clear that Joe enjoyed spending time with her. Once Jessica and the mare disappeared into the barn, Hazel turned to see where Stephen had gone. She saw 2 feet poking out from the side of the porch and knew he was eating his cookies in peace. A quick glance at the sun told her it was time to start dinner. Although she loved baking, she had completely forgotten about dinner. Just as she was about to head inside, she caught Joe looking her way. Her tummy tilted upside down as their eyes met, and for the first time, Hazel was almost unable to draw her gaze away from him. When his mouth turned up into a handsome smile, the familiar guilt had her rushing back into the kitchen as if the hounds of hell were on her heels. As soon as she was alone, she took a few deep breaths to steady herself. It wasn't that she didn't want to fall in love with her new husband. It was just a matter of feeling too guilty, because that would mean letting go of Michael's memory. She pushed the wayward thoughts aside and began making a simple dinner of biscuits and grits. Chapter 11. 24th of July, 1878, Fort Worth, Texas. The following morning, Hazel decided to enjoy her coffee on the porch to watch the sunrise. Usually Joe headed out to do chores as soon as the sun's first rays touched the horizon, but this morning he poured himself a second cup of coffee and joined her on the porch. At first, Hazel wondered if something was amiss that he had joined her, but after the initial panic wore off, she couldn't help but feel almost content as they sat together on the porch. The children were still fast asleep, and it was one of the few times Jessica was not underfoot, eagerly babbling, or Stephen was not sulking somewhere in a corner. Joe turned to her with a curious grin after a short while. "You seem to enjoy the ranch, or are you just pretending to, for Jessica's sake?" Hazel caught herself smiling in earnest. "I'm not very good at pretending, even for Jessica's sake." She glanced out over the landscape and sighed contently. "I didn't expect I'd like the hot weather or the endless plains, but it's growing on me, I suppose." Joe nodded. "I've never lived up north. I was born somewhere on the trail when my parents came south, and I never had the urge to be anywhere else. This is home to me, has always been." Hazel smiled. "It suits you. The warmer climate suits you too. When you and Jessica first got off that train, you were about as pale as snow in the moonlight. Got some color in your cheeks now." Hazel felt a blush color those very cheeks and shook her head. "You're not what I expected, Joe Spencer." Joe chuckled, the sound drifting in the cool morning breeze. Soon the sun would tire even the breeze with its relentless heat. "Is that so? Well, ma'am, what were you expecting?" Hazel shrugged. "I'm not sure, really. Just a new life, I suppose." "After Michael, your husband?" Joe asked with a frown. "How did he pass?" Hazel sighed, avoiding Joe's gaze as she told him about their dream of having a little boy and the events up until the day she buried Michael. When she was finished, Joe reached for her hand and squeezed it, offering support. "I can only imagine how hard these last few months must have been for you. To have a daughter to take care of, to lose so much in such a short time." Hazel shrugged. "It was hard, but God helped us through. He always does." Joe nodded before letting go of her hand. With Sarah, it happened so fast. She was such a natural when it came to the horses. Even had some Mexicans come ask for her help when they had a gelding they couldn't tame. Joe shook his head. "I still remember getting up that morning and thinking how blessed I was to have a son and a beautiful wife. She was busy breaking in a painted horse, one of them horses the Indians breed. That horse was trouble from the first day he came to us, kicking and biting and causing a fuss with the other horses. But Sarah wouldn't give up. She worked him for months, until that day when she finally climbed on and the horse let her sit his back. I remember thinking she truly had been blessed with a special way, and before I could have another thought, the horse bolted." Joe paused for a moment, and Hazel turned to him. She saw the haunted look in his eyes of a man who had loved and lost. "The horse threw her over in those hills. She was dead by the time I got to her." "I'm so sorry, Joe. I can only imagine how hard it must have been for you. How old was Stephen when it happened?" "About 3. He was crying not knowing why his ma was gone. It was a tough time." Hazel nodded without saying a word. She and Joe had both had their share of losses. "It took me all this time to realize I wanted to love again. I wanted Stephen to have a ma again." Joe chuckled softly. "Once you lose someone you love, you realize you have to cherish every moment you still have." Hazel met his gaze with a nod. "I know what you mean. It's as if the air tastes sweeter, the light is brighter, the sun is warmer, as if knowing that at any moment you could lose it all." They shared a smile, and for the first time, Hazel wondered if she would ever be ready to love again. Joe reached for her hand again and smiled. "I cherish every moment of having you and Jessica on this ranch. I knew God was at work when I placed that advert. I never thought he'd bless me with such a good-hearted wife or quite such a spirited little girl." Hazel's heart swelled in her chest. "Thank you." She didn't tell him how much she liked him or how she had fallen in love with Stephen because in her heart she knew she wasn't ready yet. Her smile faded as a sense of guilt rushed over her again. She wasn't sure when she would ever be rid of the feelings of guilt whenever she looked at Joe. "Stephen seems to be fond of your cooking," Joe commented when they both turned back to watch the sunrise. "Yes, it's the only time he talks to me. Do you think he'll ever get along with Jessica?" Joe shrugged. "I'm not all that sure. At first, Jessica really tried her best to coax him to play with her, but I see she's also stopped trying." Hazel nodded. "Yes, I noticed that. I thought about talking to her about it, but how can I encourage her to spend time with Stephen when he doesn't want to spend time with her? She had so hoped for a brother to play with, but it seems Stephen's disappointment is going to take longer than we expected for him to get over." Joe sighed heavily. "Yep, I thought so too. But you know what, Hazel? They're kids. Sooner or later, they'll figure each other out. It's the adults we should be worried about. Seems like they're getting on like a house on fire." Hazel smiled but quickly looked away. That was exactly what was scaring her. She couldn't remember ever feeling this strongly about Michael so soon after their meeting. She had known him for 3 years before they were married, and here she was already married to a man she hardly knew. A man who made her head spin and her heart race. "Well, I'd best get on with doing the day's chores. You got anything specific you got to do today?" Hazel nodded. "I was wondering if we go to town again, if I could buy some fabric. Stephen mentioned he needed new breeches." Joe laughed as he stood up. "That boy shoots up faster than weeds. We'll get you some fabric, but only if you make something for your husband as well." Hazel chuckled as Joe walked away. She turned back to the sun that was slowly rising in the east and knew Joe was right. They had to cherish every minute, but it was hard when she spent every second minute feeling guilty for betraying Michael's memory. Chapter 12. 2nd August 1878, Fort Worth, Texas. A month after their arrival in Texas, Hazel had settled into a routine. Although there was more housework on the ranch than in Boston, especially with the wind causing every speck of dust to land inside the house instead of somewhere on the range, Hazel loved every minute of it. Joe's kind disposition and Jessica's excitement about learning everything about ranch life was contagious. Regardless of the children still not getting along, Hazel was beginning to realize that coming south had been the right decision. Since the heart-to-heart she and Joe had over sunrise a few days ago, it was as if they had formed some kind of bond that Hazel couldn't help but appreciate. It was as if both understood that they hadn't chosen the hands they were dealt, but knew to make the best of the situation. If Hazel was honest, she would have admitted that she was slowly starting to like Joe more than as just a friend. But whenever those thoughts occurred to her, Hazel quickly shoved them back into the corners of her mind. Stephen helped his father with everything on the ranch. He was a bright little boy with an energy that only faded whenever Jessica was near. Hazel made a point to make sure Jessica didn't know about Stephen's disappointment in getting a sister instead of a brother. But although Stephen was withdrawn and reserved in Jessica's presence, he had soon crawled into Hazel's heart. Although he wasn't the son she had buried earlier that year, she was soon realizing that she could love another woman's son just as much. Just yesterday, he had grazed his knee while trying to help his father rope a steer, and instead of rushing to his father for consolation, he had headed straight into Hazel's arms. The moment had been so special, such a significant change in the relationship they had shared until then, and Hazel knew that it was only a matter of time before he accepted Jessica in the same way. As for Jessica, things were better than ever for her little rough-and-tumble girl. Since her new pa didn't care if she wore breeches on the ranch, she now wore nothing but. She spent her days following Joe and Stephen and only came home to help Hazel with chores when her mother insisted. A girl might prefer the company of boys and the fresh air the ranch had to offer, but there were still things a little girl had to learn. Things like sewing, cleaning, cooking, and of course, taking the lessons that Hazel now gave her herself. At first, Jessica had been very resistant when it came to her morning lessons, but she soon realized that Hazel was unmovable on that front. Now, as soon as breakfast was over, Jessica nagged until Hazel helped her with her lessons and she could rush outside to play. But it was the relationship between Joe and Jessica that truly warmed Hazel's heart. She had expected him to soon become irritable with the little girl trailing after him day and night, constantly peppering him with questions. But not once did Joe turn her away or refuse to answer her questions. He was patient with her, kind, and instead of chastening her for being a little rough like Michael had often done, Joe encouraged it. On numerous occasions, he had explained to Hazel that a girl needed to know how to take care of herself. It was a wild world out there, and he wouldn't always be there to protect her. Today, Joe was spending the afternoon teaching her to ride. He had spent nearly a week making sure Jessica was comfortable around the horse before he finally showed her how the horse was to be saddled. Her heart had ached to see her little girl struggle with the large saddle that probably weighed more than she did, but Joe had kindly placed a step beside the horse to make things a little easier for her. Once the morning chores were done and the laundry was gently flapping in the breeze, Hazel made a batch of sun tea before taking a seat on the porch to watch her girl learn to ride a horse. She couldn't help but be anxious, especially after learning that Joe's wife was killed after being thrown from a horse. But she knew learning to ride was an integral part of living on a ranch. Stephen's mouth was contorted with insolence, while his pa helped Hazel, and although he was close by on his own horse, helping whenever Joe told him to, it was clear Stephen would have preferred being elsewhere. Hazel watched as Jessica adjusted the saddle, and Joe helped her fasten the girth. Once the horse was safely saddled according to Joe's firm standards, he stood back and held up his hands. "Now, Jessie girl, she's all yours. You need to get up on her back and remember, whatever you're feeling, she's going to feel, so stay calm." Hazel held her breath as her daughter held onto the saddle horn with one hand before swinging herself into the saddle. Her heart stopped for a moment, expecting the horse to buck, or Jessica to become frightened and scream, causing the horse to bolt. But instead, her daughter's next move was totally unexpected. Jessica leaned forward and hugged the horse as if it was a large teddy bear. "You won't hurt me, girl, will you? You know you're the first horse I've ever climbed on, and you're going to be patient, aren't you?" Hazel's mouth curved into a smile, hearing her daughter's newly acquired Western tang, so similar to the tone in which Joe and Stephen spoke. She watched Jessica sit upright and take the reins before turning to Joe with a questioning look. "Can I take her for a walk?" Joe laughed, shaking his head in awe. "If you feel you're ready, just don't go far and don't startle her." Hazel jumped up from her spot on the porch and quickly crossed the yard to Joe. "Joe, shouldn't you be holding the horse or my daughter or doing something?" Joe laughed, and as if he had done it 1,000 times before, he slipped an arm around Hazel's shoulders. "Relax. Ma, our girl is doing just fine. If she sees you're nervous, she'll be nervous." Hazel wasn't sure whether to focus on Joe's arm on her shoulder or her daughter riding the horse at a walk, inexperienced as she was. When Jessica's laughter floated to them on the breeze, Hazel began breathing a little easier. "She's a natural," Joe said beside her, completely baffled. "I've never seen such a thing before." Hazel let out a sigh of relief. "Can she come back now?" Joe chuckled. "Not just yet. She's doing just fine. If we break her confidence today, we're going to have trouble building it back up." Standing side by side, they watched Jessica walk the horse in slow circles in front of the house. She cooed to the horse all the while, and the horse obeyed her every command. For Hazel, it was akin to watching her daughter walk for the first time, both terrifying and wonderful. When Jessica finally brought the horse to a stop, she glanced down at the ground before turning to Joe with a foolish grin. "Can you help me down?" Joe smiled, moving towards her. He lifted Jessica off the horse and set her down on her feet before clapping his hands. "A more natural horsewoman I've yet to meet. You did wonderfully." Jessica's smile beamed as she rushed towards Hazel. "Did you hear that, Ma? I'm a natural." Hazel laughed with a happy nod. "I saw. I was terrified, but you were so brave. My brave little girl." Jessica nodded before smiling up at Hazel. "Thanks for bringing us here, Ma. I don't want to be anywhere else in the world." Hazel met Joe's charming smile over her daughter's head and couldn't help but feel guilty. Joe was giving them the life she and Michael had always dreamed of, and it felt as if being happy meant betraying Michael. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye, but she quickly brushed it away. "You go on and put the saddle away. I'm going to get started on dinner." Hazel rushed towards the house, wishing that Joe and the children had not seen her unexpected tears. As soon as she was inside, she shook her head and glanced up at the roof. "God, please help me. I know Joe is good man, God, but how can I love him when I was supposed to share this with Michael? It hurts. It hurts to know that Michael isn't here, and it hurts even more when I look into my heart and see feelings for Joe there. Am I betraying Michael? Please, God, help me. Show me the way and help me towards my fate, because right now I feel like a flightless bird without direction. Amen." Chapter 13. 20th August 1878, Fort Worth, Texas. When Joe had posted the advertisement in the Matrimonial Times, he had done so in the hopes of finding a motherly figure for Stephen, and possibly also a brother for the boy. He had never thought of finding love again, but ever since the first moment he had set eyes on Hazel on the train platform, Joe had known that love was very definitely a possibility. Although he had loved Sarah more than life itself, Joe found himself drawn to Hazel in the same way he had been drawn to Sarah before their wedding. Not only was Hazel beautiful in a natural way with her honey blonde hair and rich brown eyes, but her warm and kind personality seemed to melt the ice that had frozen over his heart since the day he buried his beloved wife. It had been almost 2 months since he had collected Hazel and Jessica from the train station, and what he had thought to be a slight of attraction at first had quickly turned to like. Over the last few weeks, he had come to know her as a gentle woman with a heart of gold. He found himself more and more attracted to her, and had even once or twice found himself just looking at her, unable to fathom how God had blessed him twice with such a wonderful woman to love. The only problem was that it seemed, regardless of his feelings, that Hazel didn't feel the same way. Whenever he felt a connection, she would flee. Whenever he smiled at her, she would hastily look away. Except for the few times they had been alone, after the children went to bed or before they woke in the mornings, she always made sure one was about to be a buffer between them. It wasn't that he thought she was afraid, merely not interested in his affections. When Jessica had learned to ride and saddle a horse a month ago, he had felt something change. In the beginning, it had been as if Hazel had tried to deny the attraction between them, but now it felt as if she didn't even feel it at all. Over the last few days, Joe couldn't help but feel bothered by it. He had known that neither of them had gone into this marriage looking for love, but surely after knowing what it was like to lose someone, Hazel understood just like him that if there was a possibility of love, they should grasp it with both hands. And yet she kept avoiding him. Yesterday, Joe had been certain that ignoring the feelings he had for Hazel was the best option. If he didn't risk his heart, he wouldn't get hurt again. But this morning, when he watched her over breakfast, he knew he wanted to take that chance again. He wanted to love again, maybe have more children, perhaps even dream of a future with Hazel. But she was making it clear that she didn't share the same dreams. Usually, she escaped to her bedroom the moment Jessica went to bed. But tonight, Joe caught her just before she managed to say goodnight. "Would you mind taking a walk with me to cool down? These last weeks of summer can really become stifling." He watched her debate for a moment before she finally said yes. Joe knew it was only because she couldn't think of an excuse fast enough. She followed him outside, and together they meandered towards the barn. The moonlight lit the landscape in eerie colors with a heaven of diamonds above them, a more beautiful night Joe hadn't seen in a long time. "Everything all right? You seem awfully quiet tonight," Joe ventured, hoping he would finally get the answers he needed. Hazel shrugged. "Perfectly fine. Just tired, I suppose. Like you say, the heat can be stifling," Joe nodded. "Seems Jessica is going to want a horse of her own soon." The corners of his mouth lifted. He had never wanted a little girl, but since Jessica had come running out of the chicken coop a few days after their arrival with feathers stuck to her clothes, she had found a place for herself in his heart. Perhaps. Prosody rate percent. I can't help but feel terrified every time she climbs onto a horse, Hazel admitted quietly. I'll admit it's terrifying when they start to learn, but she's responsible, much more than I was at her age. Joe smiled and searched Hazel's face, knowing it was time to ask the question that had been hounding his mind. Are you glad you came to Texas? Hazel laughed. Of course I am. It's beautiful here, and Jessica simply loves the ranch. Although Stevens still hasn't taken to her, she still adores the animals and all the space. I asked how you felt, Joe asked quietly, searching her face. Hazel quickly looked away, but Joe gently turned her chin to meet his gaze. I can't help but feel as if you draw back, as if you're afraid to be happy here. Hazel took a deep breath and shook her head. It's different for me, Joe. I lost Michael, my son. It's hard to go on without them. Joe nodded understanding, but he still needed to know if she felt the same way. When you wrote to me, Hazel, did you hope to find love or safety? It was as plain as he could put it, and as soon as the words left his mouth, Joe feared the answer. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if she was just here to provide a home for her daughter? Hazel shook her head before her brow creased. Joe, you must understand the situation we were in. Hazel, love or safety? Joe had never been one to beat around the bush, and he wasn't going to start now. Hazel sighed. Safety, she answered in a small voice. One word made Joe's world fall apart. Over the last few weeks, he had been sure he was falling in love again, but that one word made it clear that his wife didn't feel the same way. I'm going to bed. Good night, Hazel. Joe turned and walked away, needing a moment to soothe his broken heart. He had been sure Hazel felt the same way, but it was clear she didn't. The only reason she was happy was because both she and Jessica were safe. It had nothing to do with his heart swelling in his chest whenever he looked at her. Chapter 14. 27th August, 1878, Fort Worth, Texas. Hazel had watched Joe walk away from her. He had turned on his heel and rushed back to the house before she could tell him that things had changed for her since writing that first letter. But when she reached the house, he was already in his room with the candle blown out. She spent a restless night, hoping she would have the courage to tell him in the morning how things had changed for her. But the following morning, he was gone when she reached the kitchen. He left word with the children that he needed to check fences on the north border of the ranch. Hazel knew he was only trying to avoid her. He avoided her over the next few days. Where the house had been filled with laughter and the promise of a new future, there was now a silence hanging over it that Hazel knew affected the children as well. The more she tried to gather her courage to talk to Joe, the quieter and more reserved he became. It was almost as if he was angry at her and she wasn't sure why. But her own temper was steadily climbing as well. He couldn't ask a question and run from her without giving her a chance to explain. The silence was grating on her nerves, every minute a little more. This morning, Joe headed out to check on the horses after a thunderstorm had wreaked havoc the night before. Hazel made breakfast and waited for him to join them before calling the children to the table. After frying the eggs, she had made biscuits and ham to go with it when Joe finally walked through the door. Breakfast is ready, Hazel said with a tentative smile. Joe just nodded and took a seat at the table, and Hazel began serving generous amounts of food on every plate. Back in Boston, they had never eaten this much or this well, but Hazel had soon learned that unless she started the day by giving everyone a hearty breakfast, they would all be skulking back in an hour looking for something to eat. Kids, breakfast. Hazel called to the porch, where Stephen was engrossed in his own game of cowboys and robbers, and Jessica was practicing her lasso tying. One by one, they came into the kitchen and took their seats. They said grace, and once everyone's eyes were open again, they began to eat. I noticed there were some berries growing close to the tree line. Would you like to come help me pick some after breakfast, Jessica? We can make a berry pie for dinner? Hazel asked her daughter, trying her best to dispel the awkward silence. Jessica shrugged before turning to Joe. Aren't we going to ride this morning? Joe nodded. You can go with your ma first, if you like. I can go on my own, Hazel said, feeling a little petulant that her daughter would rather spend time with Joe than with her. You can't go on your own. Rattlers, coyotes, and a few other things are out there you wouldn't have the first idea how to handle, Joe's voice said with a bite of sarcasm. Hazel stood up, her appetite suddenly gone. I can take care of myself, I assure you. You came here for safety and no use if you don't abide my warnings about inherent dangers, Joe said under his breath. Hazel narrowed her eyes, feeling her temper simmer beneath the surface. She glanced at the children who were clearly waiting for her retort, but she turned instead and walked out of the house. She rushed toward the oak tree beside the barn, knowing that if she stayed, she would have had a few choice words for Joe Spencer, some that were better left unsaid. She had barely taken a breath when she saw Joe's long legs eat up the distance between them. His green eyes were sparking with anger, but she wasn't afraid. Who did he think he was to warn her off when he felt like it after barely saying a word in 3 days? Sent. I was only trying to protect you from the dangers you don't know, Joe began in an angry voice. Isn't that why you came here, for safety? Hazel shook her head even as she narrowed her eyes. He had gone and twisted her words again, and before she could stop herself, the words spilled from her mouth. Yes, Joe, I came here for safety, only I didn't realize the biggest danger was going to be you. Joe's eyes narrowed even more. I haven't done anything to hurt or offend you. The fight simply left Hazel's body as she searched his handsome face. No, you haven't done anything you know of, Joe, but I'm beginning to fall in love with you, and that terrifies me. It terrifies me more than the rattlesnakes, coyotes, and heaven knows what else is waiting for me out there. Joe opened his mouth to argue, but he closed it just as soon. They stood in the shade of the old tree, just looking at each other, both realizing that things between them had changed and neither knew how to go on from here. It was Joe who finally broke the silence. But you said you came for safety? Hazel laughed wryly. Yes, I did. And before I could explain to you that things have changed, you rushed off in a temper and have been avoiding me since. You, of all people, should know how hard it is to love again after losing someone. Joe let out a heavy sigh and dragged a hand through his hair. He had been in such a rush to go after her, he hadn't even bothered to grab his hat first. I didn't realize. I noticed. Hazel shook her head. You've been so quiet and distant, I've been waiting for you to put us on the first train back to Boston. I won't do that. This is your home now. I'm falling for you. And when you said you came for safety, I thought that meant you didn't want more. A smile played on the corners of his mouth. Hazel, we can have so much more. Hazel nodded, but she still couldn't help but feel guilty about Michael and afraid of losing her heart again. I know, and I think I want more. It's just that I'm afraid, Joe. Joe stepped forward, closing the distance between them before carefully wrapping his arms around Hazel. She felt safe in his embrace, loved almost. She breathed in his scent and took a step back, shaking her head. What are we going to do? Joe flashed her that charming grin that made her knees go weak. We're going to forget about the letters, about what we expected would happen when you came to Texas. Instead, we're going to take it one day at a time and see where it leads. I'm just as afraid, Hazel, but I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of loving you. Hazel's heart clenched in her chest, even as a tear quietly slipped over her cheek. She hadn't known how to word her feelings, but Joe had just said it perfectly. You're right. Let's take it one day at a time. Joe slipped his hand into hers and searched her eyes. Can we finish breakfast now? My new wife is a rocket, and she might just grill us for letting our food go cold. Hazel couldn't help but laugh as they walked towards the house. Over the last few days, she had been terrified of how things were going to play out, but instead of being afraid now, she could feel the first sparks of excitement. She glanced at Joe and smiled to herself, knowing that it wouldn't be very hard to let herself fall in love with her husband. Chapter 15. 29th August 1878, Fort Worth, Texas. Although the tension between Joe and Hazel had lifted, it was still evident between the children. Joe couldn't help but wish he could do something to make Stephen spend a little time with Jessica. It was clear they would be great friends if only Stephen could get over his preference for a brother. He could see that Stephen was slightly jealous of all the time he was spending with Jessica, And although Joe tried his best to include Stephen, his son refused to take part in anything when Jessica was involved. His mornings were filled with ranch work, but every afternoon he would take a little time to teach Jessica how to ride. She was learning faster than he could have imagined, and given her age, would soon be more help on a horse than Stephen. Although Stephen was just as good on horseback, Joe still hesitated to let his son help him when it came to herding the cattle. Apart from the fear of Stephen falling off and getting hurt like his mother, there was the matter of Stephen's fear of cattle that Joe simply couldn't seem to help his son get over. Once the morning chores were done, Joe gave instructions to his ranch hands to ride the fence before he returned home. Jessica was at the chicken coop, counting all the new chickens that had hatched the day before, and he couldn't help but be curious as to where his son was. He walked up the porch and quickly stopped when he heard voices inside. Instead of entering through the door, he moved to the window and glanced inside. His son was sitting at the kitchen table, holding a pencil and mimicking the letters Hazel had written out before him. "There you go. Now sound this one for me," Hazel said patiently as she pointed to 3 letters. Stephen frowned with concentration before he finally started. "D. Oh, jug, dog!" Stephen exclaimed. "Ma, I can read." Stephen had not called Hazel Ma before this, and in that moment Joe couldn't help but swallow back the tears. Neither he nor Hazel had insisted the children call them Ma and Pa, but for his son to do it on his own, surely that meant something. He swallowed back the emotion and headed into the house. "Did I just hear someone read?" he asked, meeting Hazel's gaze over his son's head. Stephen bounded out of the chair towards his father. "Pa, Hazel taught me how to read." Stephen quickly glanced down at the floor. "Is it all right if I call her Ma?" Joe kneeled down to meet his son's gaze and smiled. "If you want to call her Ma, that's just fine by me." "Can I go play now?" Stephen asked Hazel before he bounded outside. Hazel stood up and smiled. "He's a fast learner, Joe. A very fast learner." Joe shook his head. "I never had the time." "Thank you, Hazel. I didn't expect you to." Hazel frowned. "Joe, I teach Jessica her lessons. It's only fair that I teach Stephen as well." Ever since they had reached a truce behind the barn, they had barely had any time alone together. But as Joe searched Hazel's gaze now, he knew he was falling a little deeper in love with her every day. Although Stephen still detested Jessica, it was clear he had taken to Hazel. "You're a blessing to us, Hazel." He watched her cheeks turn a pretty pink and couldn't help but smile. Did she even know how pretty she was when she blushed? Hazel quickly looked away and began putting away all she had used for the lessons. "Jessica says the same about you." The smile spread on his mouth without realizing it. "She's a real wildcat, that one. I'm sure if I told her to fetch the cattle in the north paddock, she'd ride off without even considering it." Hazel sighed, shaking her head. "That's what I'm afraid of. She doesn't care about danger. I'm afraid that one day that's going to get her into trouble. Not if we teach her right." It was the first time Joe accepted his position as Jessica's father. "I make a point of it to show her prints in the dirt, to tell her which prints are coyotes, wildcats, and where rattlers might be hiding. I know it's not much, but at the end of the day, we can only teach her as much as we can." "She's enjoying the horses," Hazel said, meeting his gaze. Joe nodded. "Perhaps her ma will enjoy them as well if she ever wanted to learn how to ride." Hazel laughed freely. "I don't think I have the courage or the skill to ride a horse." "You have both. You just need to trust me." Joe smiled warmly. Their gazes locked, and Joe felt his heart swell with love. They had promised to take it day by day, but right now Joe wanted to leap to the part where he could tell her how he felt. Instead, he nodded once and headed outside. "Jessica, time for your riding lesson." Without hesitation, Jessica jumped up and rushed from the chicken coop to the barn. Joe chuckled under his breath. Sooner or later, he would need to get her a horse of her own. Jessica led the bay mare out of the barn just as he had taught her. "Wait there," Jessica instructed Joe as she dropped her hand from the halter. "I want to try this." Joe knew the horse could very well take off at any minute, but he gave Jessica the freedom she needed to build confidence. She began walking away from the horse, not looking back once, instead heading straight to the porch where Hazel was watching. Instead of bolting, the horse kept its eyes on Jessica before it finally began following her. Joe could feel his jaw drop in awe. The horse was willingly following Jessica. When Jessica stopped and turned around, the horse was right behind her. He watched as Jessica rubbed the horse's muzzle, and he shook his head in awe. "Where did you learn that?" Jessica shrugged. "Nowhere. I just thought if she follows me, it means she trusts me." From the side of the barn, he heard a guffaw. He turned and saw his son standing to one side with a jealous look in his eyes. "She's probably got sugar." "I don't," Jessica quipped back. While the children argued, Joe turned to the porch and met Hazel's eye. For the first time, she didn't look away or rush inside. Instead, she held his gaze with a warm smile. Joe couldn't help but feel his heart swell in his chest. He was falling in love with the mother and couldn't help but fall for the daughter as well. Suddenly, he couldn't imagine what life had been like before they had come to Texas. Having them there made his heart feel whole again, his house like a home again. The only problem was Stephen. Joe wondered if he shouldn't give Stephen a talking to, but pushed the thought away. It might only make matters worse, and perhaps Hazel was right. Sooner or later, the children would find each other on their own terms. Chapter 16. 10th September, 1878. Fort Worth, Texas. What had initially been blatant disregard between the children had now turned into constant warfare. It didn't matter how many times Hazel chided Jessica for fighting with Stephen. Her daughter seemed intent on standing up against her new little brother. Things between her and Joe were steadily moving forward. Although neither had made any declarations of love, Hazel could openly admit to herself that she was falling in love again. The feeling both overwhelmed and excited her, but it was constantly dampened by the rivalry between Stephen and Jessica. Hazel and Joe had discussed the problem numerous times, but it seemed it didn't matter what they did. The children seemed intent on hating each other, causing a new fear to take hold of Hazel's heart. If the children didn't make peace and finally accept each other as their new sibling, it was going to drive her and Joe apart. Hazel couldn't expect Joe to turn his back on his son, just as Hazel would never turn her back on Jessica. Matters seemed to escalate every single day, to the point where Hazel and Joe were trying their best to keep the children out of each other's way, making it even harder for them to find time to themselves. Summer was slowly receding, allowing cool autumn breezes to change the landscape. The luscious grass of only a few weeks ago had stopped growing, and one by one the leaves on the trees were beginning to turn different hues of gold and burgundy. It was nothing like the colorful autumns of Massachusetts, but it was still pretty. On one such autumn morning, Hazel was hanging the laundry out to dry when she heard raised voices coming from the barn. She paused for a moment, thinking it was Joe scowling one of the ranch hands, when she realized it was the children. Dropping the sheet she was about to hang out back into the basket, Hazel lifted her skirts and started towards the barn. Halfway there, she saw Joe approaching from the other side. He held up his hand. "Don't go in, not just yet," Joe cautioned her before she could rush into the barn and scold both children for being impossible. "They need to sort this out sooner rather than later. Let's hope an argument will finally let them both see reason." Hazel shook her head. "They're children, Joe, not adults having a disagreement." "Maybe, but let's hope," Joe said without moving another step. They both kept quiet as they heard the voices raise even more from inside the barn. "You're a girl. You shouldn't even be in the barn. This barn belongs to my pa," Stephen shouted angrily. Jessica didn't hold back. "I might be a girl, but I ride better than you do, and you won't tell me where I'm allowed to be. Your pa said I could visit the mare anytime I like." "You're taking everything over. The chickens used to be my work," Stephen called back in a huff. "Yeah? Well, it's not like you're helping me. Instead, you just sulk the whole time. I lost my pa, you now. I know what's wanted nettin'. It's like, and your ma wouldn't have wanted you to sulk for the rest of your life. We're still alive, and so is my ma and your pa." "I didn't want you to come," Stephen shouted again. Jessica's voice reached a pitch, and Hazel knew her daughter was about to cry at any moment with anger. "Really? Then why did your pa ask us to come?" "You're just jealous because I ride better than you do. You keep complaining that we're here, but I don't see you complaining when you're eating my ma's cookies or when you're taking your lessons. You're being petty, Stephen. Either you want us here or you don't. Why? Why should I decide when it's clear Pa doesn't care what I think? Jessica's voice lowered an octave. What? Are you crazy? Your Pa thinks the world of you. Just yesterday, he told me no one has a way with Lobo like you do. I've never met a boy with a wolf for a pet. You're a brave boy, Stephen. Stephen was quiet for a moment before he called back. You're a girl. I wanted a brother. Hazel and Joe held their breaths, knowing this was the moment of truth. When Jessica spoke again, her voice was soft. You wanted a brother? Is that why you've been so mean to me? Because I'm a girl? Girls play with dolls and put on pretty dresses. I wanted a brother who I could play with, one that would look out for me, a brother who would help me stop being afraid of the cattle. Instead, I got you. Stephen, can I tell you a secret? Jessica asked. Joe and Hazel moved a little closer to hear what was being said. What? Stephen asked, still upset. I wanted a brother too. You see, I've never much done what the other girls do. I don't even have dolls. And as for dresses, do you see me wearing one right now? Stephen shook his head. Exactly. I've always preferred playing with boys to pretending to host tea parties. I've always wanted a little brother just like you. I had one, but he's with God now. You had a brother? Stephen asked, clearly baffled. Yep, he passed shortly after he was born. But in my heart, I always knew that someday God would give me a brother just like you. Silence hung over the barn for a few moments as Stephen digested the information. So, you don't want to play with dolls and steal my pa? Stephen finally asked in a small voice. Jessica laughed. I'll never steal your pa, Stephen. I was hoping we could share him, just like we share my ma. So what do you say we go play down by the creek? I've wanted to go since we arrived, but your pa said no one knows the creek like you do. Stephen debated for a moment before he finally answered her. All right, but you have to walk behind me. I know the way to the creek, and as long as you do as I tell you to and you don't mind getting dirty, we can go. Now? Jessica asked, hopefully. Stephen laughed. Yep, come on, let's go. The children didn't even notice Joe and Hazel as they rushed out of the barn towards the creek. Hazel simply shook her head in amazement. Joe had been right. It was time the kids had it out and finally realized they could be friends and not just rivals with different parents. She turned to Joe with a broad smile. How did you know? Joe brushed a stray strand of hair from her brow and searched her face. Just like I knew that I wanted you to be my wife in every sense of the word the moment you stepped off the train. Joe? Hazel sighed, searching his gaze. Do you really think we can be a real family? Joe cupped her face with his hands and smiled warmly into her gaze. Hazel, we already are. When his lips softly brushed over hers, Hazel felt her world return to its orbit for the first time in years. She felt love swell in her chest and knew that this was the happily ever after God had always planned for her. When Joe stepped back, she smiled and shook her head. Will they be all right down by the creek? Joe shrugged. They might. When he noticed the horrified look in Hazel's gaze, he laughed. They'll be fine. The creek is barely 2 feet deep and 10 foot wide. This time of year, the snakes are already settling in for winter. The worst that could happen is they might get in another fight. Relieved, Hazel smiled. Then why don't I make us some coffee? That sounds like a plan. We can drink it on the porch and discuss when you'd like to move into our room. Hazel's eyes widened, but not with fear, with surprise. Because Joe was right. With the children having settled their feud, there was finally nothing standing in the way of them having the marriage they had both dreamed of having again. Epilogue. 2nd July, 1879, Fort Worth, Texas. A year before, when Hazel had stepped off the train as a grieving widow with her daughter in her care, her whole life had been uncertain. It still baffled her how life had simply fallen into place after her first letter to Joe. She glanced over to Joe and the children, who were bringing in the herd, and her heart simply swelled. Although Stephen and Jessica were merely along for the ride, while Joe and the ranch hands controlled the herd, they were both laughing as they handled their horses. For a while, there she had thought Stephen would never be able to accept Jessica as his sister. but now the two were inseparable. Stephen taught Jessica everything he knew, and in turn, she was an avid learner, helping him with the tasks that were still a little daunting for a boy of only 7. They had become two peas in a pod, and that was the very reason Hazel was dreading tonight's conversation. She turned back to the task at hand and checked on the cake in the oven. She had baked it especially for the occasion and hoped the sweetness would help cure any sour reactions from the children. Once the horses were cooled off and the ranch hands had headed off to the bunkhouse Joe had built for them a few months before, Hazel waited patiently for her family to return. Her heart skipped a beat when Joe walked in and met her gaze. That charming smile of his still had a way of catching her breath. Never in a million years would she have expected to fall in love again. But she had. She had fallen head over heels in love with the man she now called her husband with all her heart. Of course, they still had their arguments every now and then, like any married couple did. But afterwards, there were always apologies and sweet words to heal the scarred egos. He was a kind and gentle father, one who could be tough when discipline called for it, but also one that could love when his son and daughter needed it. Hazel wasn't sure when it happened, but at some time after the argument that had brought Stephen and Jessica together, both Hazel and Joe had stopped thinking of the children as her daughter and his son. They were their children in every sense of the word. Jessica was still as rough and tumble, although Hazel insisted she wear a dress when they traveled to Fort Worth for Sunday service a few times a month. Stephen was growing up to be the mirror image of his father in every way. Hazel couldn't have been prouder if he was her own son. Joe moved towards her with a questioning look. "Are you ready?" Hazel nodded as she glanced at the cake cooling by the window. "I just need to add frosting, and then we can call them in." Joe nodded. "Stop worrying, Hazel. All is as it should be, and if it takes a few quarrels for them to accept the news, then so be it." Hazel welcomed her husband's embrace and drew strength from it, just like he had drawn strength from her in the winter months when the rain had suddenly disappeared. Over the last year, Hazel had learned that for a rancher, few things were as important as rain. Not even the price of beef on the hoof mattered if your cattle were scrawny because the fields were dry. He stood back and smiled lovingly at her. "I never thought I'd be this happy again, Hazel. God blessed us by bringing us together." Hazel nodded in agreement. "He couldn't have blessed me more than by giving me you. We've lost a lot, and I'm sure the future will bring more heartache, but at least I'll always have you by my side." "Exactly. I'm going to go wash up while you frost that cake." Hazel made quick work of spreading the chocolate frosting over the cake. As the time grew closer to sharing their news with the children, her heart began racing in her chest. She wasn't sure what their reactions would be. She only knew that she didn't want to bring them anymore. They had had such a hard time finding each other. The last thing Hazel wanted now was for them to go through it all over again. Joe summoned the children inside and waited patiently as Hazel carried the cake to the table. "Ma, is it someone's birthday?" Stephen asked curiously, glancing around the table. "No, don't be daft, Stephen. You already had your birthday, mine's next month, and Ma and Pa are both in October," Jessica quickly informed in. "Actually, we're celebrating," Joe said, reaching for Hazel's hand. "Your Ma and I have something we'd like to share with you." Joe glanced at Hazel with an encouraging look. Hazel took a deep breath. "This Christmas you'll be getting a different kind of gift," Hazel began. Jessica frowned incredulously. "I know because I already got my horse last Christmas and Stephen got his steer." Hazel laughed, shaking her head. "This Christmas it's a different kind of gift. You'll be getting a baby brother or sister." Hazel held her breath, waiting for the children's reaction. Stephen burst out laughing, shaking his head as he turned to Jessica. "It happened. I didn't think it would work, but it happened." "What worked?" Joe asked curiously as the children laughed. "We found a pond a little ways downstream from the creek. We figured it would be our wishing pond, and we each tossed in a rock and made a wish." "What did you wish for?" Hazel asked, terrified they were going to say a brother. What if they were disappointed? "For a baby brother or sister," Jessica announced proudly. "Not a baby brother?" Joe asked hesitantly. Nope, Stephen said firmly. We figured our family has two parts now, and we need a baby to tie us all together as one. We don't really care what it is, as long as we can teach it to tie a lasso and ride a horse, we'll be happy. Over the children's heads, Joe and Hazel locked gazes with a relieved smile. Joe chuckled, shaking his head. I guess it's settled then. Hazel laughed with relief, feeling happy, excited, and more loved than ever before. It's settled then? Who wants cake?